Coal mining has historically been a very taxing job at the best of times, taking a high toll on the miner's body. The work is also dangerous, and at the worst of times, death was not uncommon in the mines. The workers faced toxic fumes, the risks of being crushed or drowned, and the threat of injury from equipment. It's safe to say then that coal miners were no strangers to tragedy. But in 1966, in a small Welsh village, the miner was faced with a tragedy that posed no risk to himself nor to his colleagues. This time, it was the miner's family, his children, that found themselves victims in what has become known as the saddest day in coal mining history. Aberfan is a village located toward the bottom of the western slope of a valley in Wales. In 1869, a coal mine was sunk further up the slope from the village. At that stage, Aberfan consisted of only several buildings, but as the mine grew, so too did the village. By 1966, Aberfan had a population of 5,000, most of whom worked in the coal industry. By this time, the coal mine, now under the control of the National Coal Board, an entity owned by the state, had 7 spoil tips dotted along the valley slope. A spoil tip is an accumulated pile of spoil, that is, waste material removed during mining. These 7 spoil tips totaled around 2 million cubic meters of waste, some situated on boggy ground or on porous sandstone atop underground springs, one such tip being the 7th, which was located directly above the village and was over 100 feet tall. A quarter mile below this tip was Pantglas Junior School. The monstrous spoil tips sitting atop the slope did not go unnoticed by the residents of Aberfan, which is located in an area that typically sees a lot of rain and frequent flooding. Numerous complaints and petitions were made to the National Coal Board by Aberfan residents who had watched the piles of waste grow atop the valley slopes and were concerned for their safety. Nothing ever came of these complaints. October 1966 saw heavy rainfall in Aberfan. When spoil takes on water, it becomes muddy and loses its structural integrity, taking on a form similar to quicksand. Spoil tip 7, sitting atop the underground spring, was particularly badly saturated by the excess rainfall. During the night of the 20th of October, the tip saw some movement and decreased in height as the mound became less and less solid. On the morning of the 21st, workers starting their shift at 7:30 noticed the tip had misshapened and seemed unstable. They reported this to their superiors and work was stopped for the day. They would have to decide on a new location to begin tipping again, but this decision had already come too late. By 9:15 a.m, the tip moved again, revealing a significant portion of the spoil was no longer solid, but a dense liquid. By now, there is nothing that can be done. The tip collapses and slides down the mountain, sending around 100,000 cubic meters of spoil hurtling downhill. Hillside cottages are destroyed and their occupants killed as the mass travels towards Aberfan. As the spoil slides over an embankment and into the village, it destroys 2 water mains pipes. The water supply won't be shut off for hours, adding an estimated 14 million litres of water to the slide. Pantglas School sits on the edge of the village and is one of the first buildings to be hit. Around 240 children between the ages of 7 and 11 are just minutes into their final day before the half-term holiday, which would begin at noon. Survivors recall hearing a sound like a plane coming into land, interrupting the morning's attendance roll call, before a devastating wave of debris crashed into the school, flooding it with rubble and waste material. Dozens of houses in the surrounding area are destroyed as the massive mound of spoil makes its way through the streets before coming to a stop midway through the village. The rescue effort begins immediately. The coal miners descend upon the village, many of them having said goodbye to their children just hours before. Being experienced in excavation, they direct the early digging, ensuring residents do not accidentally collapse mounds of spoil or rubble. As the rescue effort kicks into gear, bodies are dragged from the rubble. Most are dead, some have survived. Over 20 children and several adults are rescued. At 11 a.m, the last survivor is rescued. After this, all the excavated bodies are lifeless. Despite this, the rescue work continues on relentlessly, desperately into the night. Professional rescue workers make up only a portion of the workforce as miners and residents search for their children. Over 100 bodies are recovered. In all, 144 have died, 28 adults and 116 children, 109 of them being in the school. Cause of death was typically asphyxia, fractured skull, or multiple crush injuries. In the immediate aftermath, the Aberfan Disaster Fund is set up. An outpouring of condolences from the wider public sees £1.75 million raised. Unfortunately, this is not the end of the story. The Secretary of State for Wales appointed a tribunal to inquire into the disaster. The National Coal Board denied responsibility, claiming no one could have known there were underground springs at the site of the spoil tip, despite the spring's location being marked on maps since the 1800s. Their claim also alleged that there had been no reason to doubt the tip's safety, despite the fact that there had been complaints and even prior minor incidents. The tribunal laid the blame for the incident squarely at the Coal Board's feet, saying, "Our strong and unanimous view is that the Aberfan disaster could and should have been prevented. We were not unmindful of the fact that strong words of calumny had been used before our inquiry began, but the report which follows tells not of wickedness, but of ignorance, ineptitude, and a failure in communications. Ignorance on the part of those charged at all levels with the siting, control, and daily management of tips, bungling ineptitude on the part of those who had the duty of supervising and directing them, and failure on the part of those having knowledge of the factors which affect tip safety to communicate that knowledge and to see that it was applied." The tribunal added that legal liability for victim compensation lay directly with the National Coal Board. Bereaved parents were initially offered £50 each. This figure was later changed to £500, with the Coal Board claiming it was a generous amount. In the years following the disaster, Aberfan residents demanded that the remaining tips be removed, as they still loomed over the village below. The National Coal Board resisted this, insisting the cost was too much. The government eventually came to an agreement that saw both themselves and the Coal Board each paying £350,000 towards the removal of the tips, and an additional £150,000 was forcibly contributed from the Aberfan Disaster Fund. It was only in 1997 that the Secretary of State for Wales repaid the £150,000 to the Disaster Fund, although this did not account for decades of inflation and interest, which amounted to over £1 million. In 2007, the Welsh Government finally donated the appropriate amount. The disaster, which had been caused by negligence, and the fight for justice following it, had a profound effect on the surviving residents of Aberfan, a community which saw nearly half of its young children killed. Many adults had lost their families, many children lost their friends. For a long time, the surviving children did not go out to play, as a result of both their struggle to cope with the trauma of their ordeal and the fact that many bereaved parents in the village could not bear to see children playing. Many developed PTSD and survivor's guilt. It's a frightening thought that so many innocent lives could be taken in an accident that was completely beyond their control, despite their attempts to prevent it. Even more frightening is the lengths those who had the power to prevent it went to avoid responsibility. The coal mines are closed now, the risk of a similar accident eradicated. Aberfan may continue its peaceful existence, but in the minds of the survivors, the tragedy will live on, the distant echo of a memory powering down the mountainside.